I personally always start when I'm building a program with what's my ideal state? If I'm going to do it, if I'm going to knock it out of the park, what is the perfect vision, end goal for this program? And then work my way backwards to get to that end goal.
It's funny because I know a lot of people who early on would put car pictures, this is my dream car, or this is my dream thing, or my dream vacation.
Your vision board.
Yes, on their bulletin board. And so they know that this is the why, this is the driver, this is the end goal that they're aiming for. And that's to what you were just saying. I mean, that's absolutely critical to have that. So when you have that, what is my end state? What does it look like? How would being in that end state right now feel to live in that end state? That then becomes a great way to, how do I build my waypoints throughout this whole process to ensure that, am I on track? Am I headed the right path? Am I hitting all my goals and ideas to get there? Hello and welcome to Secrets of AppSec Champions. My name is Chris Lindsay, and today we will be speaking with Bonnie Viteri. Today's conversation is going to be around building successful programs, including security programs. Bonnie is a principal technical security engineer at Yahoo. Bonnie, please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Chris. I'm Bonnie Viteri. I am a principal technical security engineer at Yahoo. My background is non-traditional. I don't have a lot of certifications or training in cybersecurity. My background's actually in behavioral psychology and a master's in criminology. So just a big research nerd who loves to build cultural bridges and, deep dive into cyber topics and programs.
Nice. I'm glad to have you. So program building, that's kind of a wide topic. Where do we start?
We can talk about probably that foundational planning, the phase one of building a program. And that really starts with, who is your audience? What's the vision? What's your mission? Do you have a charter statement? What other teams need to be involved in that collaboration to make this program work? What's the focus? People, processes, technology.
Mm-hmm.
And, what's the end goal? Is it that the program is going to be influential? Is it going to build and add to that culture? Is it a security activity that needs to be turned into something for customer or business focus? That's a good place to begin.
No, that is a great place, because when you're trying to build a program, and if you build it from a silo, you're going to fail. Bringing everybody in at the very beginning and making sure everybody's on the same page is really kind of part of the key for success.
Absolutely. Yeah. The program structure that I've seen be most effective is really, across organization. We're building those consistent connections across the organization and having their input. So you're giving them what they're asking for and what they need.
Right. Well, and when you do that, that becomes, they have the buy-in, because they were part of that. And when you bring the people who are also influential in the different teams, the different areas, they want to see it succeed as well. I mean, their name's on there, and it's not a matter of, hey, I was part of this thing and whoop-de-doo. No, it's, I was part of this thing, and, I'm proud of the work we did, and we're going to implement this across the board. And, for my own team, or, for that person, they're going to want to see it succeed. And they're going to also share, and, when they're excited about it, they're going to talk about it and get that spread out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it really lends to those long-term relationships and, the customer journeys. And then going back to them once you're complete with the product and doing that follow-up with the same people and saying, hey, is this what you expected in the end? And really bringing it to life in that full circle by going back prior to launching.
Right. Well, and I did something like this myself, not really as a program, but I can almost think of it as a program. I built an API best practice guide. And what I did was, from a security standpoint, I knew I wasn't going to have any buy-in. If I reached out to everybody and said, hey, here's a document I wrote, go have it, go read it, enjoy it, and they're not going to do it. So what I did is I reached out to the software architects within the company, and I said, I reached out to 20, everything from the large enterprise programs and teams to the small guys. But these were also the guys who were influential in the company, that these were the names that people knew, cross teams, cross orgs, cross everything. And we sat down, and I called each one for an hour and said, hey, here's what I'm planning. Here's what I'm thinking. I want a document that's based on the best coding styles that you guys want to do as a company. So it's not just security or coding best practices of Chris, but the company. And we did. We got together for calls for 3 months, 1 week, one call a week. And we spent 1 hour and we just simply started hammering through, and we sprinkled and made security a key component of that. So when we talked about what is the proper way to authenticate a JWT token for an application, API endpoint, we also discussed, well, what are return codes that should come from it if something were to fail? And what kind of expirations and what kind of things were important to ensure that we had good security. Is this a really good example, kind of in the same realm that you're working?
Yeah, that's, and I just have more questions for you. Right? I'm intrigued by how this all went at the end of the day. But yeah, that's a great example of, that customer journey, that customer feedback, and like implement it into that planning and initiation phase so that you've got a clear vision of what your end goal is and who your audience is and how this is going to provide value in the end, right? Because you've got to circle back to those success metrics at the very end and say, was I successful or was this an epic failure? And sometimes, failure is, of course, the best teacher. So
Right.
it's okay. If you don't fail in your first attempt, you probably didn't do it right.
Right. Well, in the reality is, it's okay to fail. Because
Mhm.
if you're not failing forward, you're not growing. You're either nailing it every time, which will never happen, or it's not being used and you're not collecting the right metrics. To your point, in my example, I had 20, which we ended up growing into like 27, 28, because we did acquisitions as we were going through this. And I would bring in the acquisitions to make them feel part of the company. And when I did this, for me, I was like, okay, if we're going to fail, I'm taking 27, 28 of my friends along with me.
I always say, fail fast and pivot quicker.
Yeah.
So, so as long as you're one step ahead, and you see that failure coming because you're living in it day to day, and then okay, well, where do I need to take this now? Let's pivot and let's get it right this time. And I think businesses appreciate that because, like you said, you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. So, especially if it's a new venture that
Mhm.
hasn't been done. Mhm.
Right. Well, and I like your ideas. I mean, you were talking about the starting point and where you go. You've got your idea, reaching out to the different cross teams, cross orgs, and sharing that idea, similar to what I did, is beneficial because now all of a sudden you're getting that this is a good idea. You're bouncing that idea off, and hey, from a program standpoint, if you're not getting that buy-in already from the beginning before you even start going down the road, you're not going to have it later on. But if you get the wait, that is a good idea, or this is, some programs, they just have to be done no matter what. There's a problem that needs to be solved. This program solves it. People may not like it. It's got to be done. On the other hand, there could be programs that look, when you get that buy-in and you get the teams and you bring it all together, now you're successful.
Yeah, and it all goes back to what that end goal is that you're trying to accomplish. And is it a program that's built around people? Is it a program that's built around a process, like we mentioned, the security review process that actually should be a program because we have a lot of customers that use it, and now we need to be able to give them what they need from that review process. Or is it technology? Are you just simply trying to onboard a product? Sometimes it turns into a program needed.
Hmm. Yeah, that happens. So you start out, you get the buy-in. Well, we start off, you have the idea, you get the buy-in, you start going down. What's the next step? So, you've reached out, we've agreed, yeah, this is a great idea for a process, the review, whatever. What's
Mhm.
the next part of the process?
Yeah, so you've done your foundational planning, mission, vision, charter statement, customer journeys, collaboration. Now it's time to develop it. We're going to enable program success at that point. So, what is the 5-year plan? What's the first step that we need to do to start to build it essentially? So we're developing the program kind of in that forward motion.
Right. Well, and that's a good point. You're building the target at that point. You're building the metrics early. You're building the target, so you know where you're supposed to go, where you want to reach, where you want to go, and then to your point, 5-year plan. Some of these processes are not overnight processes, as much as we want them to be.
Yeah, and I like what you were talking about. That end goal. I personally always start when I'm building a program with what's my ideal state. Like if I'm going to do it, if I'm going to knock it out of the park, what is the perfect vision end goal for this program? and then work my way backwards to get to that end goal.
It's funny because I know a lot of people who early on would put car pictures, this is my dream car, or this is my dream thing, or my dream vacation, on
Your
their
vision
desk.
board.
Yes, on their bulletin board. And so, they know that this is the why, this is the driver, this is the end goal that they're aiming for. And that's, to what you were just saying, I mean, that's absolutely critical to have that. So when you have that, what is my end state? What does it look like? How would being in that end state right now feel to live in that end state? That then becomes a great way to, how do I build my waypoints throughout this whole process to ensure that, am I on track? Am I headed the right path? Am I hitting all my goals and ideas to get there?
Yeah. So, like you just said, that's your development path. Start at the end, work your way backward, and everybody does it differently. Some people's mind works, to start here and move forward and kind of let the journey take you to your end goal. I've never found that effective in program building for insecurity, simply because we typically know what our end state needs to be, and that's a secure state. So,
Oh, I thought you were going to say boring, because if boring is your end state with security, then I think you nailed it. But if it's not boring and the place is always on fire, then you're probably missing some points.
That is true. Yeah. So you got your development design, your pieces of development, and now you need to build it and grow it, and really have that scaling that you might need for a program to be effective.
Yeah. No, I mean, and you just said it's scaling, because when so many people get together and try to put something together, scaling is probably one of those things that you don't really think about. As a small company, I know a lot of companies that will develop themselves into a corner because they didn't have that forward thought. Okay, great. We're a startup, we're going, at most we'll probably have 100, 200, maybe 1,000 customers. And then all of a sudden you break through that pane of glass, and you have 20, 30, 40,000 customers, and your database can't keep up, your program can't keep up. And so that scalability, or if you acquire other companies and you're bringing them into your process, especially for security, how easy is it to tie that new acquisition into your existing processes? Because if it's not easy, if it's a heavy uplift, is your process going to survive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a heavy uplift for, the end user who you're building this for, right? Or is it, who owns this program after it's implemented, right? Which is your next phase. But that scaling, it's really, scaling for purpose, like finding the reason that this needs to be utilized. This program is important and effective
Mhm.
because the right people are using it and adopting it and applying it. And so, once you find that purpose, like, digital transformation is a great purpose to scale any program right now. I use that as an example because that's what I'm living in.
So you're scaling, you're growing, and then you just mentioned implementation. So what does that look like?
Yeah. So the implementation is really, you've gotten to that phase, you've scaled for purpose, you've got all these people that are using the product. And then now it's that execution of implementing and executing effectively on what you've promised, right? So, who owns that? Is it the person who built the program, or is it you handing it off to somebody that was involved in it, kind of has skin in the game, and then that execution is like keeping it running and making sure that you're maintaining it and maturing it as customer needs change. So yeah, there's many phases, past that. I would even throw in who all needs to be involved. Does legal need to be involved?
Hmm.
What are the processes that are there?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And as you were just talking about, okay, you're integrated, you're implemented, you're running, and the thing that comes to mind from my previous developer experience is you have the group before you. So you formed this whole process, you've got this thing off the ground. People move, they switch teams, they switch groups, they switch organizations, they leave companies. The question is did you build this process that will be able to continue on? Did you leave documentation that could be found? I talk about the generational documentation that could happen. You have the guys who originally built something, got it started, moved on. You have the next round that came in, learned from the original creators, but they moved on. And then as you go down, almost like the telephone, where you tell somebody in an ear, hey, blah, 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 and it goes around. Eventually you get to the point of current state where the people who are now running that team, that group, that process, do they know the details of the process? Do they know where the documentation is? Is it still being followed? Are the metrics and everything still being hit? Or did it just kind of get thrown out? Oh, we don't know what this thing is. I don't even know why we do this thing. Get rid of it.
Yeah, it's that historical knowledge, right? As people turn over, and sometimes programs might falter because of that. So I had a niche for a little while where turning around programs was what I was really good at, and it was my mantra was always leave a program better than you found it. So, and that includes that documentation and historical knowledge of how you got to where you were going, based on where you came from. So, source of truth doc, are you finding documentation from 10 years ago, or are you continually updating the information as you're updating the program and the metrics and the success? And so, year to year, goals and focuses change. So, is it evolving and living on longer? So, that's how programs don't have an end of life cycle. And that's
Right.
where that's the sweet spot for any program, is to be able to say, I've built a program with no end of life.
So what you've said is a program is like an application because it will morph, it will change, it will live on, it will breathe. Another big thing that came to mind is, where do you store your documentation? Because as you were talking about this, think about the generational gap that's going to happen. Is it on a server somewhere in a folder? And what happens if that gets removed because the last person who technically knew anything about that location left and they're like, hey, this thing's been stagnant, just get rid of it? Or do you put it on like a Confluence or, centralized location? What are your thoughts on that?
So typically in the initial phases, like the planning phase and the growth phase and even the design phase, that normally starts in a folder on a G drive that's shared with, the people that need to access it, secure reasons, right? And then once you're ready to launch and you're in that implementation execution, it should move to wherever your company source of truth is. Like every company should have a source of truth. Confluence is a great one. Searchable AI, now that they have the templates that they have on Confluence now, are great. So if that's what your company is using, then that's where it should live. And the same with like trainings, because everybody has, or every company has their source of truth for training knowledge. So if you have trainings that are involved, that's where your training should live, but it should link to the documentation.
But you also bring up a good point there because when you start thinking about the progression of this application, okay, you have a centralized location, maybe part of the onboarding process. If your process is part of a foundational company piece or objective, it could be part of the onboarding. Hey, as part of your first week of onboarding, here's some documentations. Or you need to sign off that you've read this document or at least seen it. And then that way, that it's at least still having that visibility that it needs.
Yeah, and that's a good point for programs or policies that might be company wide. As you say, it's part of their onboarding, and if we circle back around to that security piece, always having a seat at the table for everyone's responsibility is security. That kind of mantra, then it should be included in onboarding.
Yeah.
And it should be built by the person at the program, or is owning the program at that point, because that's going to get you to optimization and maturity.
Mhm.
It optimizes it as your program matures.
No, I like that. The evolution, all aspects of that. I really like where you're headed with this. And the other thing that comes to mind is, the paper that I wrote, the API documentation. I occasionally I see the guys from my previous, where I did that, and we still have conversations from time to time. And I have asked, is this thing still living? And it's kind of funny. It's one of those things where there was a team or two that it kind of fell off their radar, and they're like, we really, we're struggling with these APIs. And then someone's like, yeah, didn't you go look at the document? And they're like, wait, what? And they look at, oh, this is great. It's like, yeah, all these other guys were all part of this, and they're like, oh, again, that generational gap, and thing. And to your point, centralized part of the process, onboarding, keeping that thing living, and it adjusts because to your point, we have AI today. That AI has changed everything. Things need to be refreshed and updated. If you refresh and update it, guess what? It's going to ding all the people who are connected or watching or monitoring it. So now pops back up on the radar.
You actually just touched on a really great point, and it's one that now needs to be implemented at the very top. So even before foundational planning, right, there needs to be some sort of company discovery of, has this program ever been done before? So program discovery within your environment, because somebody else might have already done it at one point, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to breathe life back into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I actually did was I made that as part of the onboarding for any developer. They had to actually see it and sign off on it. So that way anybody knew. And when they did the yearly reviews, that was also part of it. So any developer that had been there that missed it the first time, within a year, they got to see it. And, the security team being part of it was able to make sure and help, make sure that that thing's living and breathing and moving on. And you look at it now, and the vast majority of the people that were part of that project have moved on to other companies. And knowing that it's still in most of the company is still living, and, some of the guys haven't forgotten it. Some have, but they get reignited by the security team, so maybe that's part of this whole thing is, working with the security team or somebody that can bring up on a, semi-frequent basis. Hey, guess what? Maybe an internal newsletter. Hey, a great resource to make sure that you don't think, we haven't talked about for a while is this program, and this program, the benefits that it brings. And, you should be, make sure you pay attention to it, because, the outcomes of the program are very beneficial for you and for the company that, you guys are working for.
That's a good point, and that's another example of a different kind of program. And some of the earlier programs that I helped written, very HR targeted for security, right? Like how to check activation, and that lives every year. They get that same training, and the same for different teams, different targeted security trainings. That are programs that are like role based, that roll every year because they need to see that information again. So.
No, this is great. So let's put an example to what we've been talking about. So we've talked about a process, building a program, seeing it from the inception to completion and integration and implementation. Do you have an idea that you want to run with? I have one, but I'll let you. I'll give you the chance to take us down a path.
You know what? We can go with yours, and let's take it all the way to the maturity phase.
Okay, so the API document. So, we started with the idea of how can we embed better security practices within the development team. That was kind of the high level starting point. And that was the question that we were trying to ask. How could we positively influence all of development across the board?
So you've got your problem statement.
We got our problem statement. Check. What is a good entry point for virtually every application under the sun? APIs. Mm-hmm. Because your mobile phone uses APIs to communicate, websites, B2Bs, internally, everything. Communication is key through APIs. So we have a good congestion point where everything kind of comes together for integration. So we have a good spot there. What was a good way to really make sure that the developers would actually participate in this thing? Well, asking the question, how can we get developers to be part of it? Well, make it part of their development coding style. Because what happens in large organizations is developers from multiple teams, or even within the same team, have different styles of writing. If you were to bring 100 people into a room and ask them to write the same paper, share a story, and have them write the same paper, they're going to write it differently. Different angles, different viewpoints, different everything. And that's what happens with development. The coding styles, the way that they approach things are different. I posted recently about how I've written APIs after 15 years where they have never been compromised. And a lot of it is because when you start looking at doing things the right way, from an API standpoint, you've validated everything 100% on the back end. Treat everything as dirty until you validate it. If it's wrong, you kick it out. That was in the document, the API best practice document that I wrote, along with the 27, 28 other leaders within the company. And that's in there. And that really, you could see as we were testing the company, as this was being implemented, the security risks started dropping across the whole application or environment because of that, from all across the whole enterprise.
And that's a fascinating place to interject of you're watching this program and the effectiveness that it's having. And I'm sure you're doing that in some form of dashboard that is probably transparent to the effectiveness of what you've now built, designed, and implemented. And now how do you report that out? Or was that one of your original hypotheses and success metrics that now you've met that goal?
So the crazy part is we actually put it into a dashboard, just like you were saying. We also exposed that directly up to the executive board. So they had a view into it and they could look at what is the risk across the entire enterprise at any given time.
That's fascinating to think about because then you're also showing value for the security efforts and work that's going on across the company, which is fantastic and difficult to do. When you think about turning that around, that's the program that you built, and you've planned it, you've designed it, you've built it, you've implemented it, you've grown it, you've scaled it for purpose, which is now security. We're building secure products or these APIs. This transparency to leadership to continue buy-in and continue the importance that this has a long living life. How did you present that to business leaders? Because they don't talk in security terms. So what was the value shown to them in business terms?
So they love metrics. Executives love metrics. And when you can present metrics, you win. The executives are like, look, we haven't been compromised. Why are we throwing all this money into your program? You're not getting compromised. But when you can take a step back and you can say, look, the number of lines of code in production is X. And when you look at the critical, the highs, and the medium vulnerabilities across the board, the entire enterprise, and you put it into a ratio form that absolutely is on a decrease, and you acquire companies frequently, and that just bumps it up a little bit, and then it goes back down because you're applying all your stuff to it, that's a story. And that's showing value.
Absolutely. It really is. And you've reached that mature phase, right? Because then you're acquiring those companies. Yeah, it goes up just a little bit, but the program's mature enough that it takes a hold and it activates when it needs to and where it needs to. And I like that because, again, you're not getting to an end of life. And that's
No.
the ultimate goal of any program is to keep it living as long as you possibly can, especially when you put so much effort in up front.
So Bonnie, let me ask you a question. We've been talking about some really good deep detail things, and talking about how to build, a program, from the ground up, and we have a lot of great examples. Over your career, has there been somebody that's been a mentor or leader, or someone that just really gave you some really good advice?
Yeah. So I don't know if he would actually consider himself a mentor. I liked to watch his career path. And I'll never forget once he was actually a director of mine, I was underneath. And I was always very frantic if something popped up like, oh, goodness, we have to do this now. And, he said to me that stopped me in my tracks, your fire isn't my fire. And I'll never forget it as an early cybersecurity professional, hearing that and thinking, he's so right. Like, and I use it to this day. I think that to myself, is this fire someone else's fire or is their fire mine? And even to that point, like sometimes you might want to make it yours just to get some political capital. 'Cause you might need something from them at some point. So,
Yes, yes.
but yeah, your fire's not my fire.
That's a great saying. And you're right. You're absolutely right, because what you're focused on is not what somebody else is focused on. And when you shared this with me earlier, kind of one of my comments was, yeah, I remember when I ran development and people would come to me and want stuff in there, and for them it was a big fire, but it wasn't for us, and we had our own fires. And so we drop it into the stack of to-do work, but at the end. And sorry guys, if you're watching this and I did that to you, I'm sorry. But no, that's great. What's the worst advice that somebody's given you?
I mean, that's a hard one because you can kind of turn any advice around to be how you look at it, right? It's perspective. So typically if someone gives me bad advice, I try to understand where they're coming from, where, what's the core of this. But at one point in my career, actually the same person had told me, I thought managerial path was where I wanted to be. And he knew my strengths better than I did. And he said, you'll be super bored if you become a manager. You like to get your hands dirty. And I'd say it was just bad advice because I think if someone has a path in their mind, you don't want to deter that. But again, I'll say hindsight, he was very correct. I love being an engineer. I love building things, people's emotions. I'm not so sure if I would have, thrived in a management role the way I have in a technical role.
Bonnie, I certainly appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing. And this was very insightful and fun. For those watching, I hope that you gained some knowledge about, how to build a process with our examples, being able to take that, the things that worked and didn't work for us. Hopefully you guys can apply that and kind of fail forward better than some of the things that we did.
Fail fast and pivot, right?
Absolutely. Bonnie, again, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Secrets of AppSec Champions. If you found today's information valuable, hit that subscribe button on your Apple Podcast, your Spotify, or wherever you're listening to today's episode. Ratings and reviews are like gold for us, so if you're feeling generous, please leave us a kind word as it helps others find our show. Until next time, take care.